Hi everyone, it's Neil here from Moda. I'm here with Imrith today, and we're going to be discussing our latest piece on the winter triads that have just passed, that have just been announced, and what battery energy storage systems we're doing during those triads. So, Imrith, to kick us off, would you like to just tell us when the triads were?
Yeah, well, I'll start with explaining what they are. So the triads are the three settlement periods of highest demand separated by 10 days between the months of November and February. This year, they landed on the 2nd of December, 5th of January, and the 20th of January. Interestingly, the one on the 2nd of December fell in settlement period 34, and the other two fell in settlement period 35.
Which is strange, right? Because usually we tend to think of them as falling between 5 and 6.
Yeah,
But
or even maybe a bit later.
Yeah, but over the past few years, they've become a bit more unpredictable generally because more and more people are trying to forecast them. And
Yeah.
as more people try and forecast them, it means people are changing their demand profiles. And so, to put it super simply, if everyone tries to forecast a peak and changes doing something, then there's a stronger chance of that changing the peak to another time. So we had it fall slightly earlier this year. Settlement period 34 is 4:30 till 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. So what were best assets doing during the triads this year?
So there was a mixture of things going on this year. So the fact that two of the settlement periods fell in January is quite telling because that was the month we saw the highest ever revenues for battery energy storage, excluding Triad revenues. And that was mainly made up of really high clearing prices in DC. So we saw DC and E for 5 clear at £48 quite regularly. And we saw some really good FFR contracts, especially for Breach Farm and Larport Farm. They had contracts in E for 5 for about £43 per megawatt hour. So they were getting that every ETH block for the entirety of the month.
So I mean, if you're doing that for the entirety of the month, and these triads tend to fall during E for 5, so basically they'd opted, because of the high prices, they'd opted to run the risk of missing out on triads anyway.
Yeah, given that
Okay.
they got a really awesome FFR contract for that month.
Okay, so if we go through the triads, like the first one you said was the 2nd of December. So what happened on the 2nd of December? What did best assets do?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one because, as you can see on this graph, actually a lot of people missed this one. In fact, there was 4 assets which were exporting during this time, but all of them at a very low capacity. And between the 2nd of December and the 29th of November, only 6 megawatts separated the peak, which is interesting because if we look at this next graph, we can see how many assets would have actually hit this triad if this was the final triad date. But unfortunately, it seems a lot of people missed out.
Yeah, no, completely. If we go back to the previous graph a sec, just the December one, so you can see that. So most people assumed that triad was going to fall between 5 and 6.
Yeah,
So settlement period is 35, 36.
yeah.
And they exported at that point, and so everyone missed out on the settlement period 34, which was the eventual triad. Cool. What about the second triad? What happened then?
Yeah, so the second triad was, I guess, things went to plan for a lot of people. We saw a lot of people managing to hit this triad. Obviously, as I mentioned, there was FFR contracts going on this time, so the capacity of assets that actually hit this is lower or looks lower. But that's basically just because assets were providing frequency response, well, FFR especially, instead of trying to hit the triads because they couldn't.
Cool. So were there any assets in particular that did particularly well out of these triad payments, out of these receivable to Nuos?
Yeah, so there was a few assets. The Harmony Tesla sites did quite well. Hill Farm did very well. Minity, and all those managed to hit the last two triads and potentially hit a bit of the first triad. And later on in the piece, we look at a table of breaking down the estimated revenues for the receivable to Nuos and looking at how that receivable to Nuos fits into the revenues between the triad period, looking at everything from the leaderboard. So if we look at the total revenues of the 17 assets we analyse in this piece, receivable to Nuos makes up about just under 2.5%. But for some assets, it actually made up 10% of revenue. So for Hill Farm, for example, it made up almost 10% of their revenues across these 4 months.
So it's a lucrative. If you get it right, it's super lucrative, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so when we look, because we were just looking at balancing mechanism registered assets in this thing. When we look at that, how much money are we talking? How much money did they make?
So in total, it's around £23,000 per megawatt across all assets. And as I said, yeah, that represents around 2.5%. I mean, there's a lot of things to consider on a higher level here. So I mentioned, assets providing firm frequency response instead. Tenuos is given on a tariff which is locational based
by GSP.
by GSP. So some assets, for example, are in a GSP where they actually don't get receivable Tenuos. So there's a lot of factors to consider here. But generally, yeah, for those assets that have managed to hit it, I think between the top 5 assets, it represented around roughly £4,500 per megawatt across the 4 months, which is a sizable amount.
Yeah, that's massive. Well, yeah, cheers. Cheers for talking through that at a high level. There's loads more detail in the article, so be sure to check that out on the platform, and we'll see you again soon. See you later.
Cheers, guys.
Ta-ra.